Hey, welcome back to our last session, which is about technology, leadership and technology, and both of them are enablers to this. And I think you found throughout all the sessions that we've talked about, those are the two themes that kept coming up repeatedly throughout all of the other sessions. We actually have some excellent questions that we've gotten from the audience, so I want to hone in on those. So let's start with the topic of leadership, right? We've clearly established that leadership and driving change is critical for decentralized trials. I mean, any type of change requires leadership. So a couple questions from the audience, and they're sort of related, so I think we can answer them together. But one was, what's sort of the EQ profile of the leader required to effect change? Or more conversely, what's sort of the profile of the person that resists change? And then a related question to that is, what are the kinds of skills that we should be looking for if we want to have more people in leadership positions that can drive forward the change? So it's a related set of questions, but we'll open it up.
I'm not sure if there is really the universal profile of what you should have as being a leader. I don't think there is such a profile neither in clinical research nor in any other industry. But I think that the true leadership in the clinical trials is just being open to change. We know, we've been discussing for ages, that one thing that's missing within clinical trials is this patient centricity. And I know on conferences, in discussions, in white papers, we all speak about patient centricity, but we've never really defined what this actually means for the patients. So I think that a true leader will be able to challenge the whole concept behind clinical trials. Will be open to challenge every single aspect of what a clinical trial actually does at the moment, and think about all the best practices outside of the clinical research world and try to bring them on board in the best way possible. One thing that actually repeated itself in our previous discussions when it comes to profiles of non-leaders, say not the leader profile, these were people that are scared of being the first. So sometimes being the first is a really scary thing, but sometimes that's what you need to do in order to lead change and innovation. Mm-hmm. And I know that we operate in a heavily regulated industry. I know that safety of patients is the number one thing, and it should be always, but that doesn't mean that we should be freaking out when it comes to change and shouldn't just do whatever we think or we believe it's right.
Well, I think often if you can get someone who is telling you we can't change this, and you can get them past the initial, well, this is the way we've always done it, and maybe just peel back one more layer of that onion, you often hear in my position, oh, well, the regs won't allow us to do that. Oh, we got cited in an audit or a monitoring visit for that. That's the next layer that you get to. And I really push with people because it's often a lack of knowledge and inappropriate application that got there. There's been numerous times that I've been asked to step into the middle of a monitoring or an audit visit because the person on the other end is saying, this is a regulation and it's required. And I've had to find that wording and that ethos and that, frankly, use that EQ, right? To say, with all due respect, exactly where in the regulations is that? Because I'm sitting there going, it's not in the regulations. That's something you've decided is, and you've now placed it in the regulations. And I don't necessarily think it's an auditor trying to be mean. You can tell by the conviction on their face, they truly believe it. But that lack of knowledge, that lack of digging deeper to really educate and find out is critical. And I think what that actually comes back to is a core funding piece of emotional intelligence, resilience, and leadership, and that's empathy, right? Having the empathy in that situation to recognize this person isn't trying to be mean. They obviously have conviction and believe that what they think should be present isn't. I shouldn't come in guns blazing. What if I'm wrong? I would certainly want empathy from them. And that requires us to move into some of what, Daniel's talked about in some prior sessions, like self-awareness, not just what we're projecting, but how we're being received, right? There's some really critical components, I think, and characteristics. I also think that, we're looking at things like emotional resilience, perseverance, deep skill set and change management when you're talking about the next wave of the way clinical trials are conducted and being on that cutting edge and knowing that you're going to be spending a lot of your time trying to just even sell the change and the innovation, let alone actually diving into these really deep spaces we've been talking about, logistics, right, and nuances of. You're going to be overseeing all of that. And so you're going to need to come with some of those broader skill sets. I'm curious what Daniel has to say. He has his poignant face on, so I really want to know.
I mean, Raymond, you asked about the profile. And in my brain, the way that I look at things, there's three profiles. And before I talk about the three profiles, it's important to note that these three profiles transcend the clinical trial industry. The vehicle in these examples is clinical research, but it might as well be tech. It might as well be healthcare. It might as well be fill in the blank, fashion, etc., the music industry. And what those three profiles are is a leader, a manager, and a leader manager. Whereas a manager is tasked to help people cope with the complexity of their organization or the industry. Okay, the manager is somebody that says, here's all of our policies. We're not in compliance with our policies. Well, that's not what the IRB says. Well, that's not how the Office of Sponsored Research works. For the monitors, for the CTMs, that's not what the sponsor wants to do. That's not in the protocol. That's the manager's role, is to help people cope with complexity, okay, with regards to the vehicle that they're driving, in this case, clinical research. The leader's role is to help people cope with change. And the reason why these two things are so fundamentally different is because the leadership and the role that a leader will play is in saying, this is a challenging time. This is a stressful time. I understand that a week ago we were operating in paper and in person, and a week later we're operating out of a tablet and remotely, and that you're not seeing your patient. And I know that change is that change is difficult. I'm here to help you navigate and cope with that change. And then you've got the third profile of the leader manager, which is somebody who finds a good balance with understanding that their role is to help human beings cope with change fundamentally as a basic need for everybody, which is, I don't want to feel disconnected from my work. I don't want to feel like I'm not good enough to deliver the work. I'm afraid of change because it may expose me and my lack of capabilities, okay? And also be able to engage the management lever of saying, we do have SOPs we need to comply with. We do have policy infrastructure we need to understand. So there's intersectionality with the domains of leadership management and leadership management. And as it relates to the EQ profile, Raymond, I think one of the biggest drivers of our industry specifically is the fact that it attracts a very specific type of person. We work in the life sciences. Okay, the type of person that winds up in this industry typically, I won't say always, but typically is a person who is a perfectionist, is an overachiever, has a constant need for validation that what they're doing is the best. And so when you understand that our industry attracts that type of person, you understand the critical role that shame plays in the equation. And shame being the fear of disconnection. And so oftentimes what Edie was talking about with somebody who has conviction, what they believe, yes, they may have conviction, but there's some level of, I don't want her to know how afraid I am. I don't want her to know how badly I don't want to mess up. I don't want her to know how badly I grapple with the fact that I feel insecure. I feel like I'm not good enough. I feel like I can't compete. And so I need to put on this armor. Okay, this perfectionist armor, that's my mask. Or I need to put on this cynicism armor, that's the person in the room shooting down all the creative ideas. That's never going to work. We're not going to go for it. These are all armors. And so leadership's responsibility, the EQ profile, is to identify those as armors and not as the true person that's behind the mask. And understanding how do we find the common ground to cope with the change, and then let's engage the right management levers to help people cope with the complexity that the change is bringing about.
Yeah, very well said. I think those are all excellent points. I'm just going to talk a little bit from my personal experience on this. I think what I've noticed and observed is that a lot of the players that are the fastest to embrace change, put aside leadership, but just sort of openness to change, tend not to be the bigger players. So when we rolled out our electronic source system 5 years ago, it was new to the industry. It wasn't the hospitals that was buying. It wasn't the academic centers. It was sites like Daniel's. It was the sort of small to mid-sized kind of private sites that were, committed to change and were tech forward and weren't sort of bogged down with the legacy of things. I even observe on the pharma side too. I think I tend to notice that the people doing the more innovative trial structures tend to be the smaller companies. A lot of times, maybe for the big pharma, you've got the innovation departments, but outside of those innovation departments, I'm not seeing a lot of change. So it does seem like it happens with the smaller players. Maya, you mentioned Australia actually was very innovative, right? It's sort of the same idea, right? It wasn't the US, it wasn't the EU, it was Australia that innovated.
Well, and I see a tie between these things, right? Like the ethos and the EQ that we're talking about. I see, and I work with a lot of different clients, and I think that so many different spaces have a role, to play in our industry. There's definitely room for everyone. But again, like you're talking about with technology adaptation, same thing. The spaces and the clients that I work with, because obviously a lot of them I'm seeing, under the hood, or they're telling me, look, the impetus why we picked up the phone and called you is we had this problem, something happened. And so you end up finding out a lot about the personal ethos of what's going on in that department or area, whether it's a small site, a huge site, or anything in between. And just like the technology that Raymond's talking about, the ones that are more focused on EQ, ethos, they recognize that, turnover and continuity of operations very much, is impacted by constant turnover and constant, some of these things we've talked about that cause people to leave, is going to be the same folks that are also adapting the technology. And it's, if you look at the data associated with turnover, which is usually almost always tied to some level or frankly lack thereof of EQ and proper ethos, you'll notice that your larger research spaces, not to pick on the academic medical centers, they have closer to the 40% turnover rates in their clinical research coordinator positions, clinical research nurse positions, whereas your smaller sites actually have far less turnover. And it's not just the research sites. You see it on like the IRBs. IRBs also have turnover issues, continuity of operation issues. So it's not to pick on any one person, but that can't be a coincidence. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I feel like that the fact that you have very certain sites that are adapting the ethos, the technology, and they have much lower ongoing turnover and much better continuity of operations. You do the math. Yeah. 1 + 1 is 2 at the end of the day. And so I'm very curious because those that are in some of those larger AMC spaces, it was an interesting spring and summer to watch them try to pivot, obviously, because a lot of their operations were absolutely not decentralized, 100% based on a site visit. And so they had never been put in this position. And now it's interesting which ones I'm hearing, hey, let's see what worked and what didn't. We may never go back to the old way of doing things, versus how many of them I'm hearing, whether it's official or not, oh my gosh, my leadership's already talking about how do we get back to the old way of doing things? Are you kidding me? And so there's an environmental component to this. And I don't know how we scratch the surface of it, right? I've long said that it was because the larger organizations could afford. Mm-hmm. It was still considered in the margins, the turnover, the breaks in continuity of operations, some of the compliance hits they take because of it, because they frankly have more trials, more funding, more PIs. So they're not running as close a margins where if they drop one sponsor and 2 trials, that's it, they're shut down. And maybe that was the reason. But I just can't believe in a post-COVID world that we're going to continue to accept that type of EQ and leadership, regardless of what the space is.
I think that there is a connection as well with how big the organization is, but my feeling is that it comes from the fact that usually organizations, and not just in the clinical research space, like usually all organizations do not invest in leadership and train how to be a leader. So within the smaller organizations, you kind of, if you have one leader and a smaller team, you kind of like transform your leadership towards the other people. Like basically, it's like legacy, People see what you're doing firsthand, and they tend to also get educated and do that with the other people around them, basically. With the bigger organizations, if you have one leader somewhere on the top, but maybe there is like a lot of management that's actually not acting as a leader. And then until you basically face the bottom, there is no leadership, basically. No openness to innovation, no nothing. So I think that's kind of the connection between how big of an organization this is. And yeah, the size is definitely a factor, but I think that we need leadership in all of the stages, and we need to think how we can invest actually from now on more into leadership and training and preparation of people.
Well, and maybe the better way to say it is accountability. It is harder in a larger organization at times, and this is me being kind and genuine in saying this, it is harder at times to have accountability across all levels, all departments, all schools, etc., than it is when your company is 10 people that you can get in one boardroom, right? Mm-hmm. As well as I think being in certain spaces like academia where it's not as for-profit private sector motivated, accountability in some of your smaller spaces is we'll just fire you. We'll remove you as CEO. Like you failed. That's it, right? Like company goes under, or so-and-so is ousted from their position, and that's the accountability, and it's very public and very painful. And so it's handled in different ways. And maybe that's really what I'm getting at in that regard, is how do we have that accountability regardless of the size of the organization? And I don't mean beating stick punitive. Yeah. I mean the type of accountability that provides for, like you said, and shows and highlights the needs and the commitment we need to have to leadership training, to mentor management, so that we're never having to actually pull out the punitive accountability stick. It creates a better operation from the beginning.
Yeah, one of the levers for me. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Maya.
No, I just wanted to add to that gives you the accountability that's not the stick, but also gives you the freedom to grow. Because with accountability, yes, responsibilities, but it also gives you the ability to grow as a person, as a professional, as an expert. So yeah, that also makes you a leader as well. So go on, Daniel.
Yeah, I was just going to say the lever in my brain is realign the incentives, number one. Number two, realign the competencies for what it means to be a leader. Realign the competencies for what it means to be an effective manager. Stop grouping the two because they're not the same. Frankly, they're not the same. Mm-hmm. And if our conversation is the ivory tower, the academic medical centers, being the expert, being the clinical expert in dermatology, infectious diseases, etc., does not qualify you to serve in a leadership role. And so we need to back off the prescribed notion that the world expert and the academic medical center, who is, the de facto clinical leader, cannot be the chair of the department from which all decisions really revolve. And then you've got this bit of toxicity that starts to grow, and the resentment that starts to grow from the folks that are actually doing the work out there where the rubber meets the road, the study coordinators. Okay, I've got horror stories that Edie and I can write books with chapters, with volumes, with experiences at the ivory tower. One of which was me as a study coordinator looking at my workload and going, walk me through how I need to be coordinating 7 trials, one of which is an acute brain bleed trial that on any given day the patient in the unit is accumulating 200 plus concomitant medications, and I need to reconcile that with adverse events versus med history. But you also want me to cut my overtime and also deliver. And the fact that the person I reported to didn't understand that's bone crushing. It is soul crushing. It is heartbreaking. And it is the number one reason that it turns so many people off from clinical research. I've got friends that were with me, study coordinators, okay, shoulder to shoulder, who now tell me I will never go back. I had such a horrible, scarring PTSD experience with clinical research. I will never go back. And that makes me really sad, because these are people who've got immense talent, beautiful gifts for connecting with people. I've seen some of my friends who are able to be on a unit with a grieving spouse who just lost their partner, who was in a clinical trial, and has been able to have them walk away from the experience with being on a positive note. That's something that you cannot find on it. You can't put that on a job description and recruit through your HR portal. You need to find that type of talent, but it requires a very specific leadership lens. And then once you get them in the door, it takes a very specific leadership competency to support, nurture, and grow that talent effectively.
Well, and you hit on, and Daniel's heard me talk about this too, I call it the package deal. It's some misconceived notion. I talk about it mostly in healthcare and clinical trials, but it goes across all industries, that because someone has alphabet soup after their name, right? And has gone to all the right schools, right? You know, MD, JD, MBA, ABC, DEF, all of them, right? That automatically means that that individual is also an excellent manager of people, of processes, of money, of business development. And that's just not true. That's not true in any industry. No one is everything. I mean, oh my goodness, there's a reason we have 4 people on this call right now, because every one of us has expertise in a different area, even in this field, right? And so using that as a qualification mechanism is that just is debunk, and it was never right to begin with. And yet, unfortunately, in healthcare and clinical trials, it's often how people are promoted. And it's that alongside with what you just talked about, Daniel, which are the other key pieces in my mind, are the gatekeepers. And as a compliance person, I think this is where compliance starts. If you ever hear me talk about this at length, ad nauseum, and that is, one, getting the hire right. And I don't care if that is your custodial staff, your front office receptionist, your coordinators, your nurses, all the way up to your senior leadership, getting the hire right. Because think about it, how often have people been on hiring committees because admittedly they had a certain diversity quality to them, and not because they were actually associated with the work that they were about to hire someone for. And how often did you walk into an interview and you were handed something proscripted by HR that you had to ask, even though it didn't help you to determine whatsoever whether or not the person was really a good applicant? Or for me, I've seen like exercise-based interviewing that is intentionally an unrealistic situation that should never happen at your research site. And frankly, they've made the example they're giving this potential hire so hard, there is no right answer. And they're taking like joy in the fact that the person is stressing out in this room for an hour before you come back in. And I'm going, what message did you just send? You just told that person that that's what it's like to work around here. It's grueling and we hope you fail. Hello, they're interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them. So just those pieces. But again, those people were never trained. They were never pulled aside. They were so told, hey, Maya, Raymond, we're going to go ahead and throw you on this hiring committee because you're a woman and you certified, this, and you're over this team. Got it? Okay. We'll set up the interviews and let you know when to show up. There's almost never that training and ethos around that. So that's gatekeeper 1. Gatekeeper 2 is we get the right person and did we train them right? Did we set them up for success or failure? Because that's on you as the organization, right? And then there's that kind of ongoing maintenance and development phase. As this person grows in our company, then did we also help them to grow in ways that matched their goals as well as our goals for them in the organization? Because the reality is talent won't stay around forever. You do have transition that is just well-rooted, but you want to know that you set that person up for success. And I think that's a lot of what we get into. And in organizations that have really high turnover, whether it's an AMC or a small site, that know they have high turnover and don't seem concerned about it, what I hear from them consistently, regardless of the type of organization is, it won't matter. People are in and out the door in 6 months, nothing you can do about it, just the way it is. They've accepted. There's a complacency, and you actually hear it. So I'm located in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is where the global headquarters for Eli Lilly is, and the North American headquarters for Roche Diagnostics is, as well as the Indiana University Academic Medical Center and Cancer Center, all in the middle of downtown and the near north side. And so it is very common that you hear that here, right? When someone's leaving the Academic Medical Center for one of the commercial pharmaceutical companies, and people obviously move around and, come back a lot in our community. And that's what you hear over and over. Well, we can't pay them what Lilly can pay them. So, it's, and it's not because they hated it here. It's because, and no one does like an exit interview or is taking, the temperature of the room in these different environments to really find out why people are moving around. And have that conversation. So it's a complacency issue. It's easier to say that's just the way it is than to like dive in and fix it.
I will say that in the absence of effective leadership and in the absence of the industry prioritizing, like Maya, what you said about putting resources, time, and investment into the competencies of leadership, in the absence of that, we're going to trade one set of plagued issues in the industry that we haven't gotten right now before decentralized trials. We're going to trade that for a whole new set of issues that are going to come with decentralized clinical trials if we don't invest in ensuring the right leadership, that they have the right competencies and agreeing on what those competencies should be to begin with, to then hold the accountability, as we said, for the leaders who are going to usher the change forward.
And I think the scope, right? I mean, when did it become okay? This is something I started lecturing on in fall of 2019. So couldn't have possibly foreseen what 2020 was going to look like, right? And this is December of 2019. I'm presenting these metrics initially, that your turnover in clinical research, when it relates to the coordinator CRA level position, starts at 24% and hovers up to 40% in the United States. And I presented that to two different major clinical research audiences who all went, And then I said, after I said that, anyone want to gander a guess what the turnover is at fast food chains? Which are obviously viewed, looked down upon in terms of turnover and accepted as these transient employment environments. In the United States, 13 to 15%.
Wow. Oh,
Interesting.
And so that's where, I think it's that moment of guys, we have gotten way too complacent that this is okay. And it's like Daniel said, man, COVID didn't make that easier or better. It made it harder. And if we move into decentralized, we better get this right, because relying on, in order to have a decentralized trial, you're going to have some decentralized operations, right? So suddenly that trust, that ethos, that hiring the right people, those leadership skills are happening in more fragmented environments.
Yeah, actually, I fully agree with both of you. And I was actually thinking while you were speaking about other organizations, other good examples. And I have an interesting idea actually here. So what about companies like Google, right? Google made it really good, when in hiring, in training people, everyone knows that. And there are other examples, but Google is just on top of my mind. I was thinking, the turnover is not only in the staff, the coordinators, but it's actually in the sites. I think I was reading a report by the Society of Clinical Research Sites that 40 or 50, an enormous percent of sites do one clinical trial and then never go back to conducting a clinical trial because they get disappointed, they don't know how to run it. They lose money, etc., etc. So it's not just within the staff problem, but it's losing whole institutions and sites. And for sponsors and CROs, that's critical. They don't think about the individual coordinator, but they should think about sites, because that's what they need. That's where they find the patients in the end of the day, right? So I was thinking, what if we take the formula of Google, where they have each and every team is small team, actually. So going back to the size of the organization. So they're smaller teams, sometimes competing to each other and trying to do creative stuff, giving them the flexibility. So what if we apply the same formula to sites, actually, or even teams within the sites? What if we kind of start empowering the sites to perform better and better, but provide them with the training, all the resources, help them with example on our side also, how you can lead better your clinical trials, but also compare them and try to actually bring the best out there.
Maya, you're touching on macro secret sauce. So I'm gonna have to talk to you about intellectual property. But I love that you touch on that, because internally at Macro, we have what we call Leadership Academy. And it's something that it's what? Yeah, we've got everybody from interns in the room, research assistants, study coordinators, you name it. We're in the room doing Leadership Academy. And one of the things that we talk about as students of Jim Collins is this idea of clock builders versus time tellers. And in the industry is currently plagued with time tellers, people who look up at the sky, at the cosmos and the stars, and they go, it is now 3:15 in the afternoon. And then they get sacked, or they leave, or they get burnt out, and you're suddenly left with an organization where, where's Bob? Where's our time teller? Well, nobody knows what time it is. Oh my God, it could be 8, it could be 7, it could be 10 o'clock. I don't know what time it is. Bob always told, there was no investment in building the clocks. And so when you talk about what Google does great, what Apple does great, what distinguishes the good from the great, And then you want to talk about these larger organizations. What got them to be great, or what got these organizations to be good in their field, is not what's going to sustain the continuity of adapting in a time of innovation, in a time of technology disruption, because they're not actively investing on their insides for building clocks and developing the internal clocks, so that everybody at all levels, doesn't matter if you're executive level or in the most junior capacity as an intern, you know how to tell the time, because there's a framework to the culture of how we do things. How does macro do things? How does this organization do that? And as long as you're part of that team, that is part of your DNA, and you've got an internal roadmap for how you navigate the change. So I love that you gave the example of Google and the internal compute, because I do that. We do internal hackathons, like, hey, we've got a problem, go, run wild, and whoever has the best idea, that's how we're going to celebrate you. That's the signaling that we get. We encourage risk-taking. We encourage failing. And we incentivize that, and that drives a culture of innovation and change.
Yeah.
Wow. Started with a simple question. A lot of these challenges for leadership that I'm hearing are similar across industry. So I think it's universal, but it does sound like a little more pronounced in the clinical research industry. And I think, as many of you pointed out, a lot of it may have to do with, I guess, the credentialism and this sort of assumption, extrapolation, that if you're good at something clinical or whatever it is in your domain, and therefore you can extrapolate to leadership. So very interesting, and it certainly highlights why we've had so many challenges as an industry in moving forward.
So I have a kind of a follow-up question on this, because what I always tell people when I talk about the package approach that we're talking about is incentivization. And when you think about healthcare providers or clinical research PIs, right, from that provider angle, there's not a huge incentivization, in that this is not the most customer service oriented industry, right? You are not, how I lovingly describe it is, if you have stage 4 scary, you're more willing to see a provider who may or may not make you feel comfortable, looks you in the eye, holds your hand, explains every little thing, as opposed to someone who's gruffy or maybe just lacks social awareness, right? Because again, this particular person does have that clinical expertise, or does have access potentially to a life-saving therapy. And that's a lot to have on the line. That's a certain way to be, over a barrel, as the expression is, right? So how do we incentivize? How do we incentivize an industry that's not built around it? And how do we bring it back to incentivizing? Does it come from the sponsors and who they select? Does it come from using almost patient recruitment data to show that some of your smaller, more nimble sites, like a macro, actually do a better job? And maybe it's because they're paying attention to these pieces and taking this time to have a leadership academy, to have a different type of continuity of operations. Where does the incentivization come for the change? Because it seems like everyone I talk to, it's actually, especially after last year, not a hard sell that the change needs to happen or that we have a problem, but there's not a whole lot of and here's what we need to do, and here's how we'll change it, and here's who has to drive the bus. And so I'd be curious the thought. Sorry, Raymond, I know I interrupted your next question.
I personally think that the incentivization should come from changing the business model. I don't know, I'm an entrepreneur, I've been reading and following all sorts of innovations and change, in times. I love reading autobiographies. And what I've seen is that sometimes the biggest change comes from the change of the business model and the interaction within the different stakeholders. I think what stops clinical research are two main pieces. First is comfort, and when I speak actually clinical research now, I would also bring here healthcare as well. Mm-hmm. So comfort. That the patient is desperate to get help, no matter what the patient has. You always are please, doctor, help me. Please, healthcare, help me. Yes. So you don't look at the patient as the consumer, and you get comfortable that you don't owe anything, basically. And you provide what you provide, basically. So you don't optimize. So this comfort zone is what it's the biggest enemy of healthcare and clinical research. The other thing is that there is also money on the table. So that also brings comfort. And Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to say that's like stopping incentivization is the stakeholders interaction, which never changed in clinical research. We were always like, the patients are within the sites, patients work primarily with their doctors, there should be a monitor going to the site. All these interactions, they haven't changed throughout time, and maybe they should. And maybe they should. And start speaking about how do we change that. We were speaking in our previous discussion about vendors adapting to unit-based pricing. Well, maybe not just vendors should adapt their business model, but the entire industry should rethink the entire business model. Who do you pay? What do you pay for? How do you basically provide feedback, but also qualify if someone has been doing well or not well? So these are the two pieces that I think will change the incentivization and will provide change in how we perform.
Yeah, and somebody has to go first, Edie. Somebody needs to go first. Somebody needs to put money where their mouth is and say, this is unprecedented. We are going to invest in a company that embodies these values, that embodies this type of leadership style. We don't know if it's going to pay off, frankly, because we don't know if the industry is going to adapt or not. But somebody needs to have, it starts with the courageous first step of going from 0 to 1.
It's like the core of decentralized, as we were talking about, all the regulators saying it's okay, go do it, and all the sponsors going,
yeah,
but I want to be first. I don't know that I want to be the test case on this, right? I mean, it's a little bit of the same.
Yeah.
And what you referenced, Daniel.
Yeah.
There is one really good example, by the way. It's again in the pharmaceutical space. So insurance companies, obviously they're incentivized to keep their cost low, right? And paying for what they're getting. So that made, and let's say the insurance companies are, in this case, the regulators. Let's say in the States, the insurance companies. In Europe, for example, in other countries are the regulators, the government, I'm sorry, not the regulators, but the government's paying for the drugs. So eventually they saw that the price of drugs is going very high. It's increasing exponentially. So they were like, okay, come on, like stop, like to the pharma companies, like you need to clarify why we are actually giving you so much money. So they brought the whole idea, they sat together and they brought the whole idea. What if we now start charging you like value-based pricing, basically? What if we start tracking how well the patient does in the end of the day? After the treatment, during the treatment, and then we pay you according to how the patient actually does. And in this case, that's the example. Basically, it was led more or less by the insurance companies. Pharma, they rely on basically getting reimbursed, so they have to meet somewhere in the middle and make it work. So maybe this first person, first entity that Daniel is speaking, maybe should be the regulators. I don't know. What do you think?
I strongly agree that look at what happens in the Japan market. You cannot introduce a drug into their market unless you've included Japanese people into their clinical trials. And it's not enough to say you're Japanese. You've got evidence that mom and dad were born in Japan. And so suddenly, when you've got that degree of regulation in place, you've got the Lillies and you've got the Genentechs and you've got all these other pharma companies with their eyes of like, I want to be the first in the introduction of that market because it's going to be so lucrative. Now you're going to sites and asking the questions about your access to Japanese population. Now you've got the sponsors going, what kind of funding do you need for your recruitment strategy? What kind of technologies can we support? Because we need Japanese people in our trials now if we're trying to go to Japan tomorrow. So I agree with you, Maya, that I think regulatory has a strong hand and ability to help move the needle here.
And I think I agree. The only hesitancy you're seeing on my face is I think about clinical care compliance, sure. the impact, like the role that, for example, chief compliance and chief medical officers play in quality metrics, because the reality in the United States is that even with our private insurance regime, you have a significant amount of the American population receiving their care via government funding or essentially government insurance because they're in a Medicare or Medicaid program. And so if you are not compliant with all of the Centers for Medicare systems rules as a hospital, you'll shut down because 70% of your patients won't be paid for. And that's enough that you can't, I don't care, how prestigious and donor funded you are, you won't last. And so initially that system was very based on quality driven metrics. And it was another one of those well-intentioned but poor executed situations, because when I talk to folks who are in both that clinical space and that quality space, again, where our disconnect was in the clinical care in the US was the folks who decided what the quality standards aren't clinical in background, right? And so we wrote in a difference in how we reimburse you as to whether you were considered outpatient or inpatient, whether you stayed 1 night or 2, and those aren't clinical standards. That's not actually how you determine if someone was well cared for or not, whether we resolve their issue or not. And so I just would place a teeny tiny asterisk in there of ensuring, but again, this goes right back to what we're talking about, the EQ of who is in charge of these incentivizations. Because if it's put in the wrong hands, it's just going to play out the same way. And that's very frustrating to watch in the United States.
And on that note, we probably should end because I think we're over our allotted time. But I mean, this is a hard problem to solve, and I don't think we've solved the problem here. But as you can tell, this being the longest of our sessions, I don't think that's a coincidence, because I think the leadership is sort of the thread throughout all of our sessions today. So thank you very much, everyone. It's a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.